So Canada just removed $44.2 billion in retaliatory tariffs. And that is when Washington's leverage began to disappear. Ottawa stopped matching tax for tax. It kept the 50% pressure exactly where the industrial damage was most concentrated. Canada's dependence on the American market fell from 75.9% of merchandise exports to 71.7% in a single year. Washington then refused to renew the North American Trade Agreement in its current form, starting a 10-year countdown over a system supporting roughly $1.6 trillion in annual trade. And the policy that was supposed to force Canada back into line began doing the precise opposite. It taught Canadian companies, Canadian pension funds, Canadian provinces, and Canadian workers how to build a future in which the United States was still important but no longer irreplaceable. Warren Buffett had already supplied the lens. Speaking about tariffs, he said they were an act of war to some degree, and warned that over time they become a tax on goods. That is the core of what happened here. America focused on whether Canada was still retaliating. Canada focused on whether America was still necessary. Those are not the same question. One produces headlines. The other changes ports, contracts, factories, supply chains, and retirement portfolios. When you hear how the $44.2 billion retreat was designed, why the 50% wall remained in place, and what the fall to 7% actually signaled, you will understand why trade officials now fear that the United States may have won the confrontation and lost the structure beneath it. Hit subscribe because this story is no longer about tariffs. It is about who controls the next North American economy. And the most important decision was not announced with anger. It was made quietly, behind a closed door, when Canada decided to stop fighting on the battlefield Washington had chosen. Let me give you the full context because this did not happen in a vacuum. In early 2025, the White House imposed a 25% additional tariff on many Canadian imports, with a lower 10% rate on Canadian energy. The policy was presented as leverage, apply enough pain, force concessions, and prove that access to the American market could be withdrawn. Canada answered conventionally, imposing 25% counter tariffs on broad lists of American goods. Two major packages covered $14.2 billion and $30 billion in imports, a combined $44.2 billion. Steel, aluminum, and automobiles became the center of the confrontation as metals faced rates reaching 50%. According to the White House, the tariffs served national and economic security. According to Canada's Department of Finance, the countermeasures defended Canadian workers. The logic was symmetrical. You tax us. We tax you. You raise. We raise. But symmetry can be deceptive when the two economies are not the same size. The United States could absorb a prolonged exchange more easily. Canada entered the conflict with 75.9% of its merchandise exports going south in 2024. That number, 75.9%, was the vulnerability Washington believed would eventually settle the argument. American officials did not need Canada to agree immediately. They only needed Canadian exporters, provincial governments, auto workers, steel producers, farmers, and energy companies to become frightened enough that Ottawa would accept the terms later. The assumption was simple. Dependence would do the negotiating. Most Americans did not realize the other side of that equation. The same integrated system that made Canada vulnerable also made American factories dependent on Canadian energy, metals, fertilizer, timber, components, and customers. A tariff charged at the border is not paid by a flag. It is paid by an importer, then distributed through prices, margins, wages, investment decisions, and household budgets. The immediate political story was confrontation. The deeper economic story was friction inside a production system built over generations to behave like one continental machine. Canada tried to preserve the continental system through retaliation and negotiation at the same time. Officials from both sides said talks were continuing. Auto companies warned that no modern vehicle was made inside one border. Farm groups noted that Canada and Mexico together bought more than 1/3 of American agricultural exports. American employers also depended on Canadian aluminum, potash, oil, gas, lumber, and precision components. Then the numbers began to change. According to Statistics Canada, the American share of Canadian merchandise exports fell from 75.9% in 2024 to 71.7% in 2025. Exports to countries other than the United States rose 17.2%. Total merchandise trade with non-American partners climbed from $484 billion to $553 billion. That did not mean Canada had escaped the United States. A country does not unwind the world's deepest bilateral trade relationship in 1 year. But 71.7% was no longer just a statistic. It was evidence that the direction of travel had changed. For Ottawa, the strategic question became uncomfortable. Was the $44.2 billion list changing American policy or forcing Canadians to pay a second tax? If the 50% conflict in steel and aluminum was the true industrial battlefield, why keep taxing unrelated goods merely to prove Canada could strike back? The final turning point came when the government separated retaliation from resilience. Effective September 1, 2025, Canada removed the 25% counter tariffs from the $14.2 billion and $30 billion lists. $44.2 billion in total, while leaving measures on steel, aluminum, and automobiles in place. Washington could describe that as a retreat. Ottawa could describe it as recognition that most compliant goods were still entering under the Continental Agreement. But beneath the official language was a much harder calculation. Canada would stop spending political and economic capital on a mirror image fight and begin spending it on diversification, infrastructure, targeted protection, and bargaining power. That decision looked softer. It was not. And to understand why, you have to enter the room where the strategy changed. What follows is a reconstruction based on the official timeline, public policy documents, contemporaneous reporting, and the decisions that emerged afterward. It is not a verbatim transcript, but the strategic choice itself is real. The setting is Ottawa in the final days before the September announcement. The hour is late. Rain presses against the dark windows of a government conference room. The overhead lights are too white, flattening every face around the long table. A tray of coffee has gone cold. There are no television cameras. No flags arranged for a statement. No applause line waiting to be delivered. On the wall is a large map of North America. Red lines run south from Ontario and Quebec into Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. Blue lines run west through British Columbia toward Pacific ports. Green lines extend east toward Atlantic terminals and across the ocean toward Europe. On the table are 3 binders. The first is marked retaliation. The second is marked sectoral defense. The third is marked market diversification. The first binder is thick because anger is administratively complicated. Hundreds of tariff classifications, exemptions, drawback applications, requests from Canadian firms that rely on American inputs, letters from small manufacturers explaining that the counter tariff intended to punish the United States is now threatening their own payroll. A finance official turns to a page showing the combined value of the broad lists, $44.2 billion. The number is circled twice. Beside it is another figure, 25%. Across the table, a trade official has a separate chart showing the 50% pressure on metals and the 25% auto measures. The industrial sectors are highlighted in red. Those are not symbolic products. They are payrolls. They are furnaces, stamping plants, machine shops, rail cars, and communities, where one plant closure does not remain inside one building. It moves through property values, municipal revenue, retirement plans, suppliers, restaurants, and family decisions. The first question in the room is not whether the American policy is fair. No one needs another meeting to answer that. The first question is whether every Canadian response is still useful. An advisor opens the retaliation binder and reads from a summary. Broad counter tariffs have political clarity. They demonstrate resolve. They create pressure in congressional districts. They give Ottawa something visible to raise or lower during negotiations. But they also increase costs for Canadian buyers and companies. They require relief programs. They generate lobbying for exclusions. They can punish a Canadian employer for purchasing an American input that has no immediate substitute. The room is quiet, not dramatic, analytical. Then the diversification binder opens. The first page contains the number 75.9%. Canada's export dependence on the United States before the full shock. The next page contains a target range, not presented publicly as a promise, but used internally as a measure of vulnerability. The number 71.7% is written below it, the actual share reached in 2025. 4.2 percentage points may appear small on a television screen. In a trading economy, it represents tens of billions of dollars in changed destination, altered contracts, different financing, new insurance, revised shipping schedules, and relationships that did not exist before. A map is placed over the tariff lists. Vancouver, Prince Rupert. Montreal, Halifax, energy terminals. Critical mineral corridors. Rail capacity. European regulatory access. Indo-Pacific demand. Procurement agreements, long-term contracts that pay less in the first year but reduce political exposure over 10 years. The language in the room changes, not retaliation. Redundancy, not revenge. Optionality, not winning the next news cycle. Surviving the next decade. At this point, the reconstruction shifts briefly to Washington because the contrast matters. On the American side, the removal of $44, $2 billion in Canadian counter tariffs is read as evidence that pressure is working. The broad Canadian response is coming down. The assumption that dependence will force accommodation appears to be confirmed. In a communications meeting, the likely message is straightforward. Canada blinked. The 25% threat produced movement. The larger economy remained in control. But that interpretation contains a central error. It assumes the purpose of Canadian retaliation was to hurt America until America changed. By late summer, the purpose of Canadian strategy had changed. The objective was no longer to win a contest of immediate pain. The objective was to lower the amount of pain Washington could impose next time. Back in Ottawa, the three binders remain open. One senior participant points to the first binder, then the third. The strategic conclusion can be stated in one sentence. Stop trying to prove that Canada can hurt the United States and start proving that the United States cannot isolate Canada. That is the climactic moment. There is no shouting, no fist on the table. The retaliation binder is closed. The sound is small, cardboard, paper, metal rings. Then the diversification binder is pulled to the center. Silence, 5 seconds. Then 10. Because every person in the room understands what the motion means. The $44.2 billion list is not being abandoned because the pressure was imaginary. It is being abandoned because broad retaliation has become strategically inferior to targeted defense. The 50% fight will remain where the industrial stakes are real. Autos will remain protected. Steel and aluminum will remain protected. But consumer goods and non-strategic inputs will no longer be taxed, simply to preserve the appearance of equal escalation. The final instruction is restrained, prepare the repeal orders, preserve the sectoral measures, expand support for exporters, accelerate non-American market access, and frame the announcement as compliance-based de-escalation rather than strategic separation. No language about victory. No declaration of economic independence. No threat to walk away from North America. Canada still needs the United States. The point is to need it less. The physical image that remains is not a raised hand or an angry face. It is the map. The red lines south are still the thickest lines on the page, but for the first time, they are no longer the only lines that matter. And while Washington prepares to celebrate a concession, Canadian officials begin measuring success with a number that will haunt every future negotiation: 71.7%. The aftermath moved quickly because the public decision was simple. On September 1, Canada removed 25% tariffs from $14.2 billion in goods covered since March 13 and $30 billion covered since March 4. The total was $44.2 billion. Steel, aluminum, and automobiles remained outside the relief. That distinction was the whole strategy. Broad punishment came down. Sectoral defense stayed up. According to Canada's official notice, the change recognized that most Canadian goods could still enter the United States tariff-free under the Continental Agreement, while sectors without comparable American relief would remain protected. In Washington, the first reading was predictable. The pressure campaign had produced a Canadian retreat. The larger country had imposed 25% tariffs. Canada had removed $44.2 billion of retaliation, and the result could be presented as proof of leverage. But the public scorecard concealed the balance sheet reality. Canada was reducing a tax paid partly inside Canada. It was freeing importers, retailers, manufacturers, and households from costs that no longer produced strategic value. The United States, meanwhile, continued to impose barriers that American buyers would encounter at the border. Warren Buffett's economic translation was already available. Over time, they are a tax on goods. That sentence removes the flags and leaves the invoice. A tariff may be designed to punish a foreign producer. In practice, an American importer writes the check. The importer then chooses among four unpleasant options: raise the price, accept a lower margin, reduce payroll, or cancel investment. Sometimes the foreign producer cuts its price. Sometimes a substitute appears. But none of those adjustments is free, and none occurs on command. The market reaction did not arrive as one clean collapse tied to Canada's September move. It appeared in stages. Early tariff escalation had helped send the Dow down more than 700 points in one session. Then came delayed factory spending, divided orders, excess inventory, and capital assigned to politically safer projects. For retirement investors, a 5-year capital plan can matter more than a one-day market drop. Canada still suffered. In January 2026, total merchandise exports fell 7%, and exports of motor vehicles and parts dropped 21.2% to $5.4 billion. Passenger cars and light trucks fell sharply. This was not a painless masterstroke. Canadian workers absorbed real damage. Plants experienced stoppages. Families faced uncertainty. The significance is not that Canada escaped. The significance is that the pain did not produce the political submission Washington expected. By April, Canada recorded a $2.7 billion merchandise trade surplus with the world, its second consecutive monthly surplus and the largest since January 2025. Exports to the United States also rose that month. That is important because diversification did not require severing American trade. It required adding alternatives while preserving profitable access. The goal was not to replace the United States overnight. The goal was to prevent the United States from being able to threaten one border and thereby threaten the entire Canadian economy. Then institutional pressure intensified. Canada extended steel and aluminum measures into 2027, as imports above quota remained exposed to 50% tariffs. On July 1, 2026, the United States declined to renew the USMCA in its current form, starting a 10-year clock while seeking changes. The agreement remained alive, but the signal was unmistakable. Continental rules had become provisional. An agreement negotiated by Donald Trump's first administration was now treated as inadequate by the same political movement that created it. Publicly, both governments continued negotiating. Ottawa focused on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber. Washington demanded stronger rules of origin and lower deficits. But companies invest according to risk, not diplomatic adjectives. The risk was now that tariffs could be rewritten, challenged, restored under another statute, or used again whenever leverage was needed. Canada's apparent retreat removed the emotional response and exposed the structural problem. And Buffett's Playbook explains why the smaller country may have chosen the stronger strategy. The Buffett Playbook begins with a principle often mistaken for passivity: do not fight a larger opponent where size is the only advantage that matters. Berkshire Hathaway became durable by preserving capital, refusing bad terms, and maintaining options. Applied to Canada, the lesson is direct. The United States has the larger market. Canada cannot change that arithmetic. It can change how much of its future is exposed to it. That is why the $44.2 billion decision matters. Broad retaliation was emotionally satisfying and politically legible. It looked like strength, but it also tied Canadian policy to every American escalation. Washington raises 25%. Ottawa raises 25%. Washington expands the list. Ottawa expands the list. The smaller economy becomes reactive, and the larger economy controls the rhythm. By removing $44.2 billion in broad counter tariffs, Canada stopped allowing Washington to determine the full shape of Canadian economic policy. It kept the 50% defense where the danger was concentrated. Steel and aluminum are not ordinary consumer categories. They connect directly to industrial capacity, defense procurement, energy infrastructure, construction, and the survival of towns built around mills and smelters. Automobiles sit at the center of an integrated manufacturing network that crosses the border repeatedly before a finished vehicle reaches a customer. A targeted barrier can be defended as protection of strategic capacity. A broad consumer list becomes harder to justify when it raises costs, without changing the opponent's decision. Then comes the number 71.7%. The fall from 75.9% to 71.7% did not declare victory. It measured optionality. Buffett has spent a lifetime distinguishing a good company from a good investment and price from value. The same distinction applies here. Access to the American market has enormous value for Canada. Dependence on that market has a price. For decades, the value was so large that the price seemed theoretical. Tariff instability made the price visible. In more than 60 years of Buffett's deal-making and capital allocation, one pattern repeats. The party with time and alternatives negotiates better than the party with urgency and one customer. Canada could not create American-scale demand. It could finance exporters, expand ports, qualify new buyers, and turn 75.9% into 71.7%. Every additional point became bargaining power. Here is what most people do not understand. Efficiency and resilience are different. A single supplier is efficient until terms change. A single customer is efficient until access is threatened. A single corridor is efficient until it becomes a political weapon. The Buffett approach prices the risk hidden inside efficiency. For American viewers, the loss is not only tariff revenue, it is customer behavior. A Canadian firm signing a 5-year European contract does not automatically return when a tariff falls. A pension fund financing an Atlantic terminal does not unbuild it after an election. The United States may remain Canada's dominant partner, but dominance loses value as alternatives become permanent. Buffett's warning was broader than one tariff schedule. He argued that trade should not be weaponized, and that America benefits when other countries prosper. Prosperous partners buy American products. Uncertain partners hold back capital. Frightened partners build redundancy. The Buffett-style verdict is devastatingly simple. America won the invoice and began losing the account. The 25% tariff produced a payment. The 50% tariff produced protection for selected producers. But the fall to 71.7% revealed the long-term cost. And the $44.2 billion retreat revealed that Canada had stopped measuring strength by how much damage it could return. From that point forward, the consequences moved far beyond customs policy. The first cascade is economic and physical. Canada's non-American trade rose sharply in 2025, giving ports, rail corridors, energy projects, critical mineral processing, and export finance a new strategic purpose. These projects do not need to replace the United States. They only need to make another destination credible. Every credible buyer lowers the value of an American threat and makes 71.7% less permanent. The irreversibility matters. A tariff can disappear with a signature, a port already financed, a supplier already qualified, or a 10-year contract already signed does not disappear with it. The $44.2 billion repeal occurred on one date. The adjustment it accelerated has no clear expiration date. The 50% barriers can be negotiated. The memory that produced the alternatives remains. The second cascade is political inside the United States. Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Maine, and the farm states experience Canada as a customer, supplier, energy source, and production partner. A manufacturer can support tariffs in principle and oppose the tariff raising its metal cost. A farmer can demand tougher enforcement and still fear losing a market built over decades. As those contradictions accumulate, congressional pressure becomes local rather than ideological. The third cascade is institutional. USMCA supports approximately $1.6 trillion in annual trilateral trade. Refusing to renew it in its current form did not end the agreement, but it placed a 10-year clock beside every long-lived investment decision. A battery plant, mill, or parts platform must now ask whether the rules will remain stable long enough to recover its capital. An institution does not need to collapse to lose value. It only needs to stop being trusted. Legal instability adds another load. In 2026, the Supreme Court rejected the administration's use of emergency economic powers for broad tariffs, forcing a search for replacement authority. Import tax revenue that had peaked above $31 billion in 1 month later turned negative as refunds exceeded collections. Businesses were left asking which tariff wall would survive, under which law, and for how long. The norm being eroded is predictability. The fourth cascade is defense. NORAD is a binational command responsible for aerospace warning, aerospace control, and maritime warning. Five Eyes intelligence cooperation and Arctic surveillance are not customs agreements. The danger is that economic distrust bleeds into procurement, industrial capacity, technology controls, and critical mineral policy. A radar component delayed by a trade dispute, a specialty metal subjected to uncertain rules, or a defense supplier forced to duplicate production may appear minor in isolation. Repeated across a modernization program, those frictions raise costs, slow schedules, and encourage each country to build around the other. In an Arctic facing Russian activity, Chinese interest, sparse infrastructure, and enormous modernization costs, Canada may seek more sovereign capacity and more non-American options. That does not end NORAD tomorrow. It changes assumptions beneath it over 20 years. The fifth cascade is international. Japan, Germany, South Korea, Australia, the United Kingdom, Poland, the Philippines, and Mexico all watch the same question. If Canada must hedge against Washington, what exposure should every other ally hedge? China does not need Canada to become a client, and Russia does not need NORAD to fail. They benefit when Western allies spend money protecting themselves from American unpredictability and divert attention from defense production, cyber resilience, and Arctic security. This is the devastating irony. Tariffs intended to reduce American dependence can encourage Canada to reduce dependence on America. Measures intended to strengthen North American manufacturing can fragment the North American platform. Pressure intended to force obedience can finance alternatives. Structural engineers understand what follows. Simultaneous stress through economics, law, politics, defense. And alliance confidence reduces the entire system's margin of safety. The problem is no longer 5 separate disputes. It is one integrated structure becoming less resilient. And that is why the final numbers matter so much. Canada removed $44.2 billion in broad retaliation. It kept the 50% pressure where industrial capacity was at stake. Its export concentration fell from 75.9% to 71.7%. The United States declined to renew the Continental Agreement in its current form and started a 10-year clock over approximately $1.6 trillion in annual trade. None of those facts alone proves that America has lost Canada. Together, they prove that Canada has begun pricing the risk of America. That is the deeper story behind the title. Canada did not stop fighting because the tariffs worked exactly as Washington intended. Canada stopped fighting in the form Washington understood. It stopped answering every tax with another tax. It stopped allowing anger to dictate the entire strategy. It preserved targeted protection, absorbed real pain, and began purchasing options. The philosophical lesson is older than tariffs. Power is not merely the ability to impose a cost. Power is the ability to impose a cost without changing the other side's long-term behavior against you. A threat that creates compliance may be leverage. A threat that creates a substitute may be self-liquidating. The moment the target begins building a future in which the threat matters less, the apparent victor has already started losing. Buffett's playbook is patience, liquidity, discipline, and alternatives. Canada's version is ports, contracts, sectoral defense, diversified markets, and a lower concentration number. The United States still has the larger economy. It still has the most valuable consumer market in the world. It still possesses enormous leverage. But leverage is an asset, and assets can be overused. Watch the $44.2 billion that disappeared from the retaliation list. Watch the 50% barriers that did not disappear. Watch 71.7%, because that number is no longer a measurement of trade alone. It is a measurement of trust. The next negotiation will not begin where the last one ended. The infrastructure is being financed. The contracts are being signed. The countdown is running. And every year Canada learns to live with less dependence, America's old leverage becomes a little more expensive to use.